Truth Triumphant by B.J. Wilkinson. Chapter 21. Adam and the Church in China. The return from captivity, which Cyrus authorized almost immediately after the capture of Babylon, is the starting point from which we may trace a gradual enlightenment of the heathen world by the dissemination of Jewish beliefs and practices. The name of Adam singles out an unusual leader whose history is connected with the Church of the East in China. When he was the director of the Assyrian Church in China, a memorial in marble was erected in that land in 781 to the praise of God for the glorious success of the Apostolic Church. From the time that it was excavated in 1625, it has stood as one of the most celebrated monuments in history. The events which led to its erection and the story told by its inscription reveal the early missionary endeavors which carried the gospel to the Far East. When the Spirit of God moved upon the heart of Adam, director of the Assyrian Church in China, and his associates to erect this revealing witness, New Testament Christianity had for some time been shining there brightly. The fact that these missionaries possessed sufficient freedom to plant this remarkable memorial in the heart of the empire, when in Europe the father of Charlemagne was destroying the Celtic Church, shows a remarkable existence of religious liberty in the Orient. It furthermore discloses that the Church of the East was large and influential enough to execute so striking an object. To indicate how great a statesman Adam was and how strong he was in 781 in the circles of influence in the Chinese, Japanese, and Arabian empires, let the following facts testify. He was a friend of the Chinese emperor who ordered the erection of the famous stone monument of Duke Kuo-tsu, a mighty general and secretary of state, who defeated the dangerous Tibetan attack. Of Dr. Isu, Assyrian clergyman, loaded with state honors for his brilliant work. Of Kobo Daisha, the greatest intellect in Japanese history. Prajna, renowned Buddhist leader and Chinese teacher of Kobo Daisha. Of Lu Yen, celebrated founder of the powerful Christian religion sect known as Thil of Immortality. Of the Arabian court where Harun al-Rashid, most mighty of the Arabian emperors, had just secured the services of an eminent Assyrian church educator to supervise the Harun's new imperial school system. In 1625, this remarkable stone was unearthed in or near the city of Chang'an, long known as Sian or Xianfu, but now recently called by its ancient name, Chang'an. It was the most cosmopolitan city among all nations when the memorial was erected. It is located about 1,500 miles inland from the coast. The imperial Tang dynasty, AD 618 to 907, was on the throne. It is generally conceded that among the historians at that period of the Tang emperors was the most brilliant, liberal, and progressive era of all the Chinese dynasties. Chang'an was already well known 2,000 years before Christ, being called the well-watered city. Its history is the history of the Chinese race. Its civilization influenced all surrounding nations. For example, Kyoto, the ancient capital of Japan, is laid out on lines following the plan of Xianfu, Chang'an. G.F. Samsam, in his learned work on Nipponese, has given a splendid description of Chang'an in recent years. Recognizing the debt of Japan to China, many authors point out that it was the civilization of the Tang period which influenced Japan, a civilization built on the splendid contributions made by the Church of the East. Politically, China was at this moment perhaps the most powerful, most advanced, and the best administered country in the world, certainly in every material aspect of life. In the life of a state, she was overwhelmingly superior to Japan. The frontiers of her empire stretched to the borders of Persia, to the Caspian Seas, and to the Altai Mountains. She was in relations with the people of Amnan, Cochin, China, Tibet, the Tarim Basin, and India, with the Turks, the Persians, and the Arabs. Men of many nations appeared at the court of China, bringing tribute and merchandise and new ideas that influenced her through her thought and her art. Persian, and more remotely Greek influence is apparent in much of the sculpture and painting of the Tang period. There has since, in the days of the Wei emperors, been a friendly intercourse between China and Persia. A Zoroastrian temple was erected in Chang'an in 621. It would be too much of a digression to go on to speak of the paintings, the bronzes, the pottery, the colored silks, the poems, and the fine calligraphies. It is enough to say that all these arts were blossoming in profusion when the first Japanese missions found themselves in the Tang capital. And what perhaps impressed them more than the quality of Chinese culture was its heroic dimensions. Nothing but was on a grand and stupendous scale. When the Sui emperor builds a capital, 2 million men are set to work. His fleet of pleasure boats on the Yellow River is towed by 80,000 men. His caravan, when he makes an imperial progress, is 300 miles long. His concubines number 3,000. And when he orders the compilation of an anthology, it must have 17,000 chapters. Even making allowance for the courtly arithmetic of official historians, there are enormous undertakings, and though the first Tang emperors were rather less than immoderate, they did nothing that was not huge or magnificent. To the Japanese, it must have been staggering. The famous monumental stone now stands at the Peilin Forest of Tables in the western suburb of Chang'an. It was set up by imperial direction to commemorate the bringing of Christianity to China. Dug out of the ground by accident in 1625, where it evidently had laid buried for nearly 1,000 years, this marble monument ranks in importance with the Rosetta Stone of Egypt or the Behistun inscription in Persia. It has engraved on it 1,900 Chinese characters, reinforced by 50 Syriac words and 70 names in Syriac, another tongue of the Christian newcomers, and the official tongue of the Syrian church was Syriac. The unearthing of this corroborating evidence to the greatness of early Christianity in China created a profound impression upon the scholars in all countries. Many works have been written about it. The revealing facts embedded in the chiseled letters never cease to grip the attention of anyone interested in the history of the true church. How great was the degree of civilization in these days throughout Central Asia and East may be seen in the following quotation from a recognized author. With unexampled honors, Cao Sung and his empress received back to China in 645. The Prince of Pilgrims, Hu Sang, after his 16 years' pilgrimage over 100,000 miles to Fo-de-Fang, the Holy Land of India, in search of the precious sutras, or true good laws, finding everywhere among the tribes of Asia the highest degree of civilization and religious devotion. The author states at a footnote at the bottom of the page that it was his privilege to examine the stone firsthand, and having made an airplane trip there for that purpose, he took particular pains to take pictures of this renowned memorial and to study the city with its surrounding country. Hu Sang was beginning his research journey just after Columbanus had finished his glorious labors. The Celtic Columbanus, however, carried his Bible with him as he journeyed east, while Hu Sang traveled west from his native China to obtain the scriptures of Buddha in India. Many who have written about this great stone mistakenly call it the Nestorian monument. The word Nestorian is nowhere found on it. In fact, the inscription has no reference whatsoever to either Nestorius or Nestorians. Moreover, it does not explicitly recognize the head of the Church of the East by giving the name and the date of the Patriarch of Baghdad, Persia, who at that time was the ruler of the Church in its vast extent. These are the words translated from Syriac. In the day of our father of fathers, my lord Hananan Isio, Catholicos Patriarch. in the year 1092 of the Greeks. That would equal to 781. The title at the head of the monument, engraved in 9 Chinese characters, as translated in Seki's book, a monument commemorating the propagation of the Ta Qin luminous religion in the Middle Kingdom. Ta Qin, this author asserts, was the Chinese name of Judea, and the luminous religions was the term they used for Christianity. In the period in which this monumental witness was erected in China, 3 great empires ruled the world. In the west, the Pope crowned Charlemagne on Christmas Day in 800 as head of the newly created Roman Empire. In the far east, the Chinese world, considered by some at that time the strongest of all states, was ruled by the Tang dynasty. Between these lay the mighty Arabian Empire. The most famous emperor in history of this Arabian Empire was Harun al-Rashid. There was much to facilitate contract between Persia and China at this time. Most of the nations lying between them were well populated. Travel was frequent. The highways were well cared for, and all abundance of vehicles and inns to facilitate merchants and tourists was at hand. It would yet be many a century before the devastations of the Mongols and the ravages of Tamerlane would lay these countries desolate. The population was large enough to keep back the encroaching sands which later buried many a fine city. The Buddhists of China were constantly traveling west, especially to India, to obtain ancient writings of the faith. Much evidence goes to prove, moreover, that the rulers of China were tolerant of or indifferent to all faiths, so that the door was open to the arrival of new religions. Did Confucius counterfeit Daniel's religion? About 500 years before the commencement of the Christian era, a great stir seems to have taken place in the Indo-Aryan as in the Grecian minds, and indeed in thinking minds everywhere throughout the then civilized world. Thus, when Buddha arose in India, Greece had her thinker in Pythagoras, Persia in Zoroaster, and China in Confucius. In a former chapter, it was stated that within 100 years after the death of the prophet Daniel, Zoroastrianism flourished in Persia, Buddha rose in India, and Confucianism began in China. From Pythagoras, possibly a pupil of Zoroaster, philosophy had obtained its grip upon Greece. According to the dates generally assigned to Daniel and Confucius, the leader of the Confucianism was about 14 years of age when the great prophet died. There is a striking similarity between the parts of the philosophy of Pythagoras and that of Confucius. A quotation from a well-known author shows that the close relationship between Buddhism and Confucianism. It is related that a celebrated Chinese sage known as the noble-minded Fu, when asked whether he was a Buddhist priest, pointed to his Taoist cap, another religion, Taoism. When asked whether he was a Taoist, pointed to his Confucius shoes, and finally being asked whether he was a Confucian, pointed to his Buddhist scarf. As the Jews had been dispersed throughout all nations, the stirring prophecies of Daniel were disseminated everywhere. These led all people to look with hope for the coming of the great restorer. The Magi, who traveled from the east to worship at the Savior's manger, are but an example of those who were stirred by the promise of the coming one. Suetonius and Tacitus, Roman historians of the 1st century A.D., bear witness to the universal expectation of a coming Messiah. The prophecy of Buddha concerning the predicted prophet is another example. Buddha says, 500 years after my death, a prophet will arise who will found his teaching on the fountain of all Buddhas. When that one comes, believe in him, and you shall receive incalculable blessings. Also, it is reported that Confucius, the famous founder of China's national religion in the 6th century BC, said that a saint should be born in the West who would restore to China the lost knowledge of the sacred tripod. It must not be concluded that the Chinese emperor, surrounded by the greatest scholars of his realm, took the astonishing decision to permit Adam to build the celebrated stone monument solely because he was influenced by the teachings which he had heard from the Christian missionaries of that date. He and his scholars were well aware of the remarkable events which crowded the history touching touching the Church of the East. The Chinese were not ignorant of the expansion of Christianity among the nations of Central Asia. Furthermore, it is not without solid basis that the commentators claim that China is contemplated in the well-known prophecy of Isaiah, which foresees converts up to the gospel coming from the land of Sinim. There are scholars of research who conclude that the original Chinese colonists who settled in the western branch of the Yellow River came from the plains of the Euphrates. It must be true that the great facts of early Bible history were known in some form in the Orient from the early days, there being much travel back and forth from Persia to China. As Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, so the separatists from the Tigris and Euphrates valleys are considered by some to have taken their long trek through Turkestan to the Wei River of northwestern China, carrying many elements of the Chaldean civilization to that region. From the Babylonian plains, they are reckoned to have brought many religious and astronomical observances which they practiced in China, among which was the honor bestowed upon a weekly period of 7 days. How early and how influential the Jews, being repeatedly carried as captives to the east, were in China before the Christian era may be seen in the following quotations. Many of the Israelites whom God had dispersed among the nations by means of the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities found their way to China, and were employed, says the celebrated chronicler Pierre Gobelin, in important military posts, becoming provincial governors and ministers of state, and learned professors. Pierre Gabel states positively that there were Jews in China during the Fighting States period of 481 to 221 BC. Thus, we know that China in Daniel's day was in contact with the Old Testament religion. According to Spring and Autumn, a book compiled by Confucius himself in 481, notice is taken of the frequent arrival of white foreigners. Seiki thinks that these could be from the plains of Mesopotamia. The vigorous earlier Han dynasty from 209 BC to 89 carried its conquest far to the west and to the Babylonian plains. Study in a previous chapter touching the work of the Apostle Thomas in India cites the old tradition that after he founded Christianity in the Hindu peninsula, he then brought the gospel to the country of the Yellow River. The Apostle Paul in his day said the gospel had been carried to the ends of the earth. How strong was the gospel in China is seen in the statement of the ante-Nicene father Arrhenius, written about 300, which enumerated that nation as one of the Oriental people among which the church was established. It is also to be noticed that Isaac, the patriarch of the Assyrian church, ordained a metropolitan missionary for China in 411. As metropolitans, generally known as missionaries, usually were the directors from 6 to 8 supervisors of church provinces, each of which in turn was the presiding officer over many clergy, it can be readily understood that Christianity, in order to have such a large growth, must early have been planted in the Middle Kingdom or China. Returning to the discussion of the Old Testament teachings in China long before Christ, it may be seen that the teachings of the Old Testament came to China not only by way of India, but also by way of Turkestan. During the period in which the counterfeiting of the Old Testament by heathen religions began, King Darius, an able Persian organizer, effected the conquest of Bactria. That rich and prosperous kingdom lying between the northeast of Persia proper and the Oxus River is said to have contained 1,000 towns. Darius pushed his conquest onto the famous city of Khotan in Turkestan. This was a pivotal city in the commerce and the travel between China and Bactria. Between Khotan and China, unnumbered cities, since buried by the moving sands, covered the territory of eastern Turkestan. Where anciently were the seats of flourishing cities and prosperous communities, says a Chinese chronicler speaking of the region, is now nothing to be seen but a vast desert. All has been buried in the sands. It was centuries after the Christian era before these cities began to disappear. In Turkestan, the road to China was flanked by many cities. Consequently, the roads had so many travelers that no one need to search out companions for his journey. The roads, moreover, were then in such splendid condition that the journey from Cotton to China could be completed in 14 days. Thus, the bewitching story of the new and aggressive religion in the West could have spread quickly eastward on the lips of travelers. If the revolution brought about by Confucius is considered in light of the generations influenced and the length of its duration, it can be reckoned as one of the greatest revolutions in history. For 2,000 years, Confucianism held undisputed sway over the Chinese people. Being a man of highest literary ability, and one that was conversant with the current events of his time by means of travelers, Confucius could not have been without foresight enough to make his system of religion escape too great a competition with Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Judaism. He found China politically and religiously in chaos. He gave to his native land a religion and a code of social ethics which stood for centuries. It is believed that he understood and profited by the great Reformation which had taken place in Judaism, and that he incorporated in the new system he was premeditating ideas not only from Judaism, but also from Zoroastrianism and Buddhism. It seems most logical to believe that Confucius beheld the great movements just mentioned, and by his superior ability saw his opportunity to do the same for China. Consider how great was the reform which came to Judaism in the days of Daniel, and how the heathen received much of their wisdom from the Old Testament. George Rawlinson, historian of the ancient civilizations, writes, "Parallel with the decline of the old Semitic idolatry was the advance of its discrete antithesis, pure spiritual monotheism. The same blow which laid low the Babylonian religion in the dust struck off the fetters from Judaism. The return from captivity, which Cyrus authorized almost immediately after the capture of Babylon, is the starting point from which we may trace a gradual enlightenment of the heathen world by the dissemination of Jewish beliefs and practices." While these three founders of new religions, Zoroaster, Buddha, and Confucius, were willing to borrow from the cult earlier than their own, it is evident, in order to escape the charge of copying, that they would want their own system not to be a duplication of the one which they had borrowed. There is sufficient basis in the teachings of Confucius to conclude that he, like Buddha and Zoroaster, was stimulated enough by a new light shining in the West to launch a new religious system of his own. The fundamental truth of the Supreme Being was impressed so powerfully on Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Confucianism in that the establishing of their schemes of religion, they maintained one chief deity. The elimination of lesser divines in favor of the one God over all, such as the Old Testament has taught for centuries, won the immediate favor with the masses. One more important point will be presented as an outstanding evidence that the teachings of the Old Testament were known and imitated throughout the Far East. The knowledge of the creation's 7 days had been so deeply impressed upon Oriental peoples that it wove itself into all religious life and customs of the Orient. Speaking of the widespread influence of the Old Testament system of worship, Thomas McClatchy writes, "According to the Zen Avesta, the god Ormunzd, or Adam or Noah deified, create the world in 6 different intervals, amounting in all to a whole year, man in almost exact conformity to the Mosaic account, being created in the 6th period. Etrurians state that God, Adam or Noah, created the world in 6,000 years, man alone being created in the 6th millenary. Eusebius mentions several of the ancient poets who attached a superior degree of sanctity to the 7th day. Hesiod and Homer do so, and also Callimachus and Linus. Porphyry says that the Phoenicians dedicated 1 day and 7 to their god Kronos, Adam appearing in Noah. Aulus Gellius states that some of the heathen philosophers were accustomed to teach only on the 7th day. Alexander Severus used to frequent the temples on the 7th day. Lucian mentions the 7th day as a holiday. The ancient Arabians observed a Sabbath before the era of Muhammad. The mode of reckoning by 7 days prevailed alike amongst the Indians, the Egyptians, the Celts, the Sclavonians, the Greeks, the Romans. Josephus then makes no groundless statement when he says, "There is not any city in Grecians, nor in the barbarians, nor any nation whatsoever, whether our custom of resting on the seventh-day Sabbath has not come." Dion Cassius deduces this universal practice of computing by weeks from Egyptians that he should have said from the primitive ancestors of the Egyptians, who were equally the ancestors of all mankind. Theophilus of Antioch states as a palpable fact that the seventh-day Sabbath was everywhere considered sacred, and Philo, Apudgrot, declares that the seventh-day Sabbath to be a festival not of this or of that city, but of the universe. Especially to be noted in the above citation is the reckoning by 7 days not only in India, but also among the Celts, the Slavs, the Greeks, and the Romans. Homer and Hesiod, who lived about the 9th and 8th centuries before Christ, are included in those believing in the sacredness of the seventh day. Such was the powerful influence of the Old Testament, not only in European but also in Oriental lands, even to the determining of their division of time. Already mention has been made of the large number of Jews who dwelt in China after 400 BC. Throughout the centuries they observed the seventh-day Sabbath, and one author, writing in recent years of his investigations touching the small remnant of these Jews still remaining in China, says, "They keep the Sabbath quite as strictly as do the Jews in Europe." If honoring the seventh-day Sabbath was true among the ancient inhabitants of the land of Chaldea, from which it asserted that the ancestors of the Chinese came, it is also prominently true in the ancient China. A passage from one of the classical works of Confucius, written about 500 BC, is as follows. "The ancient kings on the culminating day closed their gates. The merchants did not travel. The princes did not inspect their domains." Charles de Harlez adds, "It was a sort of a day of rest." All the evidences, therefore, would seem to support the conclusion that Confucius was influenced either directly or indirectly by the teachings of the Old Testament in general, and by the visions of Daniel in particular. An interesting footnote by the author reads as follows. Many translators of the Chinese render the culminating day differently. Most all agree at some length that this section of the Yi King, the oldest Chinese book, is a glorification of the seventh day as the symbol of returning or success. The influence of this glorification determined the customs of kings, merchants, and landed possessors. Christianity's early growth in China. At the time of the erection of the celebrated stone monument, missionaries of Adam's faith had penetrated everywhere throughout Central Asia, and already possessed multiple churches in China. How far these evangelists had spread the knowledge of Adam's mother tongue, the Syriac, may be gathered in the following works of Ernest Renan. It will be seen what an important part the Syriac language played in Asia from the 3rd to the 9th century of our own, after it had become the instrument of Christian preaching. Like the Greek for the Hellenistic East, the Latin for the West, Syrian became the Christian and ecclesiastical language of Upper Asia. Even today, there are in other countries many thousands of believers who derive their church pasts from the Assyrian communion and who use the Syriac in their divine services. Political, social, and commercial relations between China and the Western nations were carried on many centuries before the population of its capital dedicated the memorial monument. About 120 years before Christ, an official embassy of exploration was sent out by the Chinese emperor to study the kingdoms of the West and to bring greetings to their peoples and rulers. This exploration party returned to relate that they had gone through Bactria, Parthia, Persia, and Tachin, that is, Palestine, the country of Adam's religion, according to the monument. 200 years later, or in the days of the apostle, a Chinese general led the victorious regiments of his emperor across Persia to the shores of the Caspian Sea. The Chinese chronicles report an embassy from the Emperor of Rome to the imperial court of China about 168 A.D., and one or two similar embassies about 100 years later. They also record that about 200 years later, A.D. 381, more than 62 countries of the western regions sent ambassadors or tributes to the Middle Kingdom. If the Chinese traveled so extensively to the west, it is no wonder that Seiki exclaims, "It would be very strange if the energetic Syrian Christians, full of true missionary zeal, did not proceed to China after reaching Persia around the middle or end of the 2nd century. Another authority sees them well settled in China in 508. Thus there is ample justification to conclude that many true believers in Asia, several centuries before Adam and his associates, erected the monument to their church. Early beliefs of early Christianity in China. Many documents and historical references tell of the faith held by the Church of the East in China in Adam's day. Already notice has been made of the prophecy which Isaiah uttered predicting the converts in that far distant land. Testimony has also been used to show that in 481 to 222 BC, Jews held important military posts, some becoming provincial governors, ministers of state, and learned professors. These Old Testament church members would teach the Chinese the truths of the law and of the prophets. It is astonishing to see how the Assyrian church preserved the unity of its faith throughout its far-flung spiritual domain, whether it was in China, Tibet, Turkestan, Persia, or China. The church members who worshipped according to the teachings laid down by the Church of the East were not only in harmony with one another in these different countries, but also with the headquarters in Persia. It is known, first of all, that it was strictly an evangelical church. Many writers of note have commented on the apostolic nature of its missionary activities, and also upon the New Testament simplicity of its beliefs and practices. These believers constantly claimed that they accepted only that which was taught by Christ, the apostles, and the prophets. In quiet simplicity, accompanied by the minimum of ceremonies, they had accomplished an unusual amount of missionary work. The position held by Adam substantiates the splendid organization of the Church of the East, also the strength of its position in China. On the monument, Adam is called Pastor, Vice Metropolitan, and Metropolitan of China. This official title would indicate the churches he directed must have had many members and were considerable in strength. The inscription further reveals that Adam recognized the Father of Fathers, or Catholicos, at Baghdad. In China, Adam and his associates were obliged to battle against polygamy. The custom of binding the feet of Chinese girls was a distressing problem to the Christian missionaries. The belief that the Chinese, in the spirits of the dead, glorified by ancestor worship, arrayed against the missionaries the forces of spiritualism, magic, and astrology. The two languages composing the inscriptions upon the monument, the Syriac and the Chinese, might raise the hope that the cumbersome system of the sign language of the Chinese would give way before the better alphabetical and method represented by the Syriac. The prevalence of the sign orthography, even to the present time, indicates the stubborn resistance to any endeavor to simplify Chinese. However, Adam at his command had a vast Christian literature for use. Seiki gives in detail the titles of 35 books which, whole or in part fragments, were discovered in 1908 in a cave in northwestern China, all of which were the literature put forth by the Church of the East among the Chinese. He writes, "They had the Apostles' Creed in Chinese. They had a most beautiful baptismal hymn in Chinese. They had a book on the incarnation of the Messiah. They had a book on the doctrine of the cross. In a word, they had all the literature necessary for a living church. Their ancestors in the 8th century were powerful enough to erect a monument in the vicinity of Hsianfu. From Adam to the Mongol emperors. The time which elapsed from the Tang dynasty of the days of Adam to the close of the Mongolian conquest was about 500 years. During that time, the nature of the development of the church in the East and the land of the Yellow River is seen in the character of the clergy, the type of sacred literature used, the life of the believers, the abundant activities of the communities, and the public services rendered by it to the nation. The clergy who had led the Church of the East to victory were men of consecration and scholarship. They found the ancient religions of Confucianism and Taoism in China entrenched in the affections of the people. Confucius himself upheld polygamy. Confucius was also a spiritist. He ever believed that he was accompanied by the spirit of the Duke of Chao. The Buddhists were idolaters. They worshipped the image of Buddha. They terrified the people both by their teachings and by the representation upon the walls of their temples of horrible pictures and statues. A practice that continues today if you happen to visit a Buddhist temple. They also set forth the carnal delights of a Buddhistic paradise. Nevertheless, in the face of such powerful heathen religions, the Assyrian church grew and prospered. Buddhism in China was harsh. It provided no savior, and until it copied the atoning doctrines of Christianity, it was generally repulsive to the people. In the midst of such darkness like this, Adam and his associates trained a clergy that was the most enlightened of its day. It was in the same type of clergy who saw the Mesopotamia had carried the Greek and Roman civilizations to the Arabians, who in turn passed it on to the West. Concerning the teachings of these Syriac Christians, it is recorded in Syriac upon the Chinese monument. In the year 1092 of the Greeks, which would be 781, my lord Yabuzid, priest of the core episcopates of Kuduman, the royal city, son of the departed Milus, from Bach, the city of the Tahiristan, erected this monument, wherein is written the law of him, our Savior, the preaching of our forefathers to the rulers of the Chinese. It must not be thought, however, that their growths progressed smoothly. Often they met with bitter opposition. Upon the death of one of the great Tang emperors, the throne was often occupied during the 2 short reigns by rulers of inferior capacity. One of these favored Buddhism. The Buddhists, seizing this advantage, raised their voices against the Christian religion. In the other region, inferior scholars of the Taoists, favored by imperial majesty, ridiculed and slandered Christianity. A furious religious persecution against all Western religions took place in 845. Some think that it was in this hour of trial that the believers buried the celebrated stone in the ground to preserve it. The time of trial was due to influence maliciously exercised over the emperor by Confucianists and Taoists. Christianity, however, did not seem to have been much affected by it, Minganes observes, because in an early and important statement of the contemporary Patriarch Theodosius, AD 852 to 858, still mentions the archbishops of Samarkand, India, and China. It is noteworthy that this last persecution was commanded by one of the last Tang emperors. The dynasty was tottering to its fall. Then the closing years of anarchy and confusion, in which 7 different dynasties succeeded one another. Through the favoring smile of the government, not only were several splendid churches erected during the early years of Christianity in the capital itself, but orders were given to aid in the erecting of the same throughout the 10 provinces. By this, it is not understood that there was a union between church and state. For example, George Washington could be a member of a certain church and use his influence to favor the erection of churches in his own denomination, without its indicating that the clergy were paid officials of the state. Such was the situation in China. From the year 1020 and onwards, stirring tales were widespread throughout Europe concerning a great king over Tartar tribes, who was a Christian, and who was called Presbyter John. Coupled with this news came Coupled with this came the news written about the year 1009 by the metropolitan of the capital city in the northwestern province of Persia to the Catholicos of Baghdad concerning 200,000 Turks and Mongols who had embraced Christianity. The strength of the Church of the East in the 11th century may be seen in these records, as Dean Millman says editorially, "The Christianity of China between the 7th and 13th century is invincibly proved by the consent of Chinese, Arabian, Syriac, and Latin evidence."